Welcome to Lecture 1, What is Inductive Logic? By the end of this lecture, you should be able to 1. Answer the question, what is logic? 2. Describe key differences between deductive and inductive logic. And to do this, by first producing examples of each deductive and inductive arguments, by distinguishing the domain of appropriate application for each type of argument, and by stating the kinds of conclusions, that is, certain or uncertain conclusions, that each can produce. Logic, broadly construed, is the study of ideal reasoning. That is, it is the study of patterns of reasoning that are more likely to lead us to more reliable conclusions in various domains. Reason is often represented in the shape of arguments. An argument is a sequence of statements consisting of premises and a conclusion. The conclusion states the point being argued for, and the premises state reasons intended to support that point. Logic is often divided into two types, deductive and inductive logics. This course, LPS 31, deals with inductive logic, whereas LPS 30, for example, deals with deductive logic. Let's consider arguments of each type of logic, then see about extracting their general properties. Deductive arguments are of the sort that follow. For example, we have a proof that if a number is even, its square is also even. This is a very simple deductive argument for that claim in arithmetic. And we have the syllogism next, in which if an individual, here Omid, is a bachelor, we can conclude that Omid is unmarried. Deductive arguments concern claims about logic, mathematics, or relationships of ideas. This is actually an important point. That is to say, deductive arguments have an appropriate domain of application. When such arguments are sound, they lead to certain conclusions, right? If the reasoning in the first argument is correct, right, that the squares of even numbers are also square is certainly true. And there is no more evidence that we could gather that would now convince us otherwise. Similarly, if the argument that Omid is unmarried, right, has that its premises are true, so Omid is indeed a bachelor, and all bachelors are indeed unmarried, then it must be the case that Omid is unmarried, and that is certain. The truth of such claims, then, is determined by convention. Now, this is a subtle and very deep point. That is, the way we find out, right, and determine that the square of an even number is even, is by looking at its agreement with our rules and definitions that come from arithmetic for what even numbers are, for what the operation of squaring does, and so on. In the case of seeing that Omid is a bachelor implies that Omid is unmarried, we have to look about our agreed upon convention, about what being a bachelor means and what its relationship to being unmarried is. Imagine we define bachelor differently, right? Then this could be a untrue conclusion that we arrived at. If we decide that bachelor means married, right, then none of that reasoning goes through. Similarly, if we agree to different definitions or different rules of inference about what even numbers are, or about what acceptable algebraic operations are, we could get that the square of an even number is not also even. The way we find out whether such an argument is in fact sound is by checking with the conventions that we've agreed upon, the rules and definitions that we determine are going to apply to arithmetic or to language. Now, there are those who have held a different view about the nature of deductive truth and of logical truth broadly. The account that I just gave, I would want to tell you, is known as the conventionalist account of logic, which was perhaps most famously articulated by Wittgenstein in his philosophical investigations, where he argued really that the reason that we have these sorts of truths has to do crucially with our biology, our culture, and our aims. That is to say, if we were to change the sort of world we lived in, or if we were to change the sort of biology we have, or the sort of culture we have, or the aims we have, we would expect these rules, right, of how we use words, or what our arithmetic would look like, would themselves look different. That said, I would also want to bring to your attention that not all philosophers, logicians, mathematicians think of deductive truth in this way. And there have been historically many attempts at giving a different characterization of what deductive truth is about. And I would direct your attention to just one of these non-conventionalist accounts, in particular a realist account, that believes that the deductive truths, say of logic, have the shape that they have because the world is a particular way. And this account is by UCI's own Penelope Maddy, which, if you don't know her work, has written beautifully on a range of topics in the philosophy of mathematics, logic, and cognition. And I direct you to her book, The Logical Must, where she argues for a picture under which logic is effective not merely as a function of its relationship to our biology, our culture, and our aims, but also because some minimal core of logic actually describes some essential structural features of the natural world. Good. Now let's move on to inductive arguments. The examples that we can consider are, right, one in which we've observed from some batch of apples that out of M of them that we've collected, imagine out of 20 of them, 10 of them were green, and we infer that from the entire batch of apples, all of whom we've not yet observed, that the same fraction are green. You might recognize this as similar to forms of statistical inference, where we look at the sample that we just collected and infer that the population has similar properties, right? This is when we take a sample of people and find their height and infer that the population height is going to be similar to the sample height. Another inductive argument for us to consider is one in which we observe that Nima is coughing, that many people who cough are sick, and we guess that Nima is likely to be sick. Right? And we're building off of some sort of past experience to make this sort of a informed guess. These inductive arguments essentially concern claims about matters of empirical fact. That is to say, matters of fact about the world on which evidence comes to bear. Now, let's pause and think about how that is not like the previous cases, right? First, let's observe that even when these arguments are done well, right, when they are sound, their premises are true, and the pattern of reasoning deployed in them is a reasonably good pattern, they lead to uncertain conclusions, right? We might gather more apples and recognize, no, the sample that we had of M apples in which N were green was not representative of the population of apples we're investigating. That another fraction of apples is in fact green in that larger population. Or our informed guess that Nima is sick, given that Nima is coughing, can be wrong. We can find out that Nima is fine. Perhaps something got caught in her throat. Good. Now, the essential difference here is that the truth of such claims is determined by empirical investigation. That is, we don't find out what is the fraction of apples that are green by looking at our definitions, by looking at either the rules of arithmetic or by looking at the rules of how we define words in natural language or relate concepts, right? The only way to find out whether such arguments are right or wrong, right, and whether the conclusions that they posit are right or wrong in particular, is by checking their agreement with the world. And what we observe is that we can essentially always be wrong, even when we're reasoning quite well. Good. So we have laid out and contrasted deductive arguments with inductive ones, and observed that they exhibit key differences. First, their domain of application is that of logic, mathematics, or relationships of ideas in deductive contexts. That is to say, that is what deductive arguments apply to. And in the latter, we have that matters of empirical fact are what inductive arguments apply to. Importantly, in the deductive case, these can, when done appropriately, right, lead to certain conclusions, whereas in the inductive case, they necessarily lead to uncertain conclusions, conclusions such that more evidence, right, can indicate to us that we were wrong. Now, we can step back and think just a bit more about that domain and recognize that this is a really important and significant distinction to bear in mind. Deductive reasoning applies to relationships of ideas. It applies when our conclusions are about things in logic, things in math, things in language.
Whereas inductive arguments have the inductive domain. They're about all of empirical matters of facts, all of science, all of medicine, law, policy, finance, and so on. All of the things in our natural world. Good.
We return to the goal of logic and observe that not all arguments are equally good. The essential task of logic, then, is to help us in distinguishing good arguments from bad ones, or better arguments from worse ones. particularly to distinguish reliable patterns of reasoning from unreliable patterns of reasoning. We note that there are at least two ways an argument can be bad. First, it can have false or implausible premises. And second, it can involve invalid or weak inferences. Logic often focuses on the latter, that is, on assessing the strength of inferences, as opposed to establishing the truth or plausibility of premises. Importantly for us, inductive and deductive logics differ in the standards they characteristically apply when assessing the quality of an argument's inference. Deductive logic assesses arguments according to their validity. That is, an argument is valid just in case the truth of its premises guarantees the truth of its conclusion. Let's consider several simple examples of deductive arguments and assess the truth of their premises and the validity of their inferences. For our setup, let's consider a fair six-sided die. In this case, we can observe that it has come up as a 3. Our first argument has as its premises, the die came up either even or odd. And the die did not come up even. And its conclusion, thus, the die came up odd. Notice here that the premises are true, that is, indeed, the die did come up either even or odd. This is tautologically true. And that the die did not come up even. Right. Now, we can look at the inference and notice that indeed, right, once we have shown that the die did not come up even and combine that with the fact that it either came up even or odd, that it is valid to infer it came up odd. Right. So here the inference is valid and the premises are true. To take another argument, we have the die came up either even or odd as before, but now we have the die did not come up odd. Thus the die came up even. What to notice here is that the inference is still valid, right? If in fact the die did not come up odd, and the die came up either even or odd, it must have come up even. It is simply that the second premise, the die did not come up odd, is false. Hence, this is a bad deductive argument not in virtue of an invalid inference, but merely in virtue of having a false premise. Now consider the following. The die came up either even or odd. Thus, the die came up odd. Notice here, the premise is indeed true. This is our tautology. That must be true no matter what. Indeed, the die must have come up either even or odd. And even the conclusion is true. The die did come up odd. However, the inference from the die came up either even or odd to the conclusion it came up odd is false, because given that premise, it could have also come up even. Hence, here, while the premises are true, the inference and even the conclusion is true, the inference is not valid. To recap, good deductive arguments have the following features. They have true or well-supported premises, and they have valid inferences. Turning to the assessment of inductive arguments, what we find is that inductive logic assesses arguments according to their inductive strength rather than their validity. and where an inductive argument is inductively strong, just to the extent that the truth of its premises renders the truth of its conclusion probable. Returning to our die-rolling vignette, we can assess some inductive arguments in this context. For the first, we have the premises: the die is fair, that is, each face is equiprobable or equally likely to come up, that is, the die is not unfair or loaded, and that the die did not come up either 2 or 4, with the conclusion that the die is likely to have come up odd. We can observe that here the premises are true, the die is fair, and I would assure you of that by stipulation of this imagined scenario, and that the inference is inductively strong-ish. And to spell out what we mean by that, here we have that the die did not come up 2 or 4. So that means the only way for it to have come up even is to come up a 6, right? And the other ways that it could come up are 1, 3, and 5. So 3 out of 4 times, if the die has not come up 2 or 4, we should expect it to have come up odd. So we have a 3/4 probability of odd. And so this is a reasonably strong inductive inference to the conclusion that the die has come up odd. For our next argument, we have that the die is fair, but that the die did not come up 2 or 4 or 3, with the conclusion thus the die is likely to have come up odd. Here we note that the conclusion is still drawn from an inference that is modestly and inductively strong, or at least better than chance, right? In the sense that if the die did not in fact come up 2 or 4 or 3, what we have left are 1 and 5 for how it could come up odd, and 6 for how it could come up even. So we should have a 2/3 chance of it having come up odd. Now again, this is not terribly strong, but this is better than chance. However, we can note that one of the premises is not true, right? In particular, the second premise, that the die did not come up 2 or 4 or 3, and note that here we're using a exclusive or. So we mean it did not come up 2, and it did not come up 4, and it did not come up 3. It's false, because indeed the die did come up 3. Finally, we have the argument, the die is fair, thus the die is unlikely to have come up odd. Again, while the conclusion is even a reasonable inference, if you were to gamble that the die is likely to have come up odd, you would be gambling with favorable odds. However, and you would win that bet, the premises don't warrant an inference, right, to the die having come up odd. The die is fair is not enough to make a strong inference that the die came up odd. Indeed, if that is the only premise we have, the only information we have, the best inference that we could make, given that it's a fair die, is something like there's a half chance that the die came up odd and a half chance that the die came up even. So the inference here is not better than chance and is not inductively strong. More generally, we can begin to think of grades of inductive strength. So arguments come in terms of inductively weaker and inductively stronger inferences. And we can consider, for example, an inductively stronger inference being one where we observe that 90% of well-established findings in psychometrics are replicable. and that the Stroop effect is a well-established finding in psychometrics, and thus infer that the Stroop effect is likely replicable. Whereas a weaker inductive inference would be the observation that under 35% of established findings in social psychology are replicable, and that ego depletion is a well-established finding in social psychology. Thus, ego depletion is likely replicable. To recap, good inductive arguments have the following features: true or well-supported premises, as in the deductive case, and strong inductive support, or inference, for their conclusions. One way that we can think of the contrast between how we assess the strength of deductive arguments, or rather deductive inference, and inductive inference is to observe that deductive inferences come in the form of either valid or not valid, where for valid deductive inferences, the truth of the premises guarantee the truth of the conclusion, whereas inductive inferences come in degrees, and inductively strong inferences make the truth of the conclusion highly probable, whereas inductively weak inferences provide little or no support for the truth of the conclusion of an inductive argument. And in the inductive case, we remember that there is always an element of uncertainty. Unlike for deductive arguments, we can never be assured, however true our premises or strong the inductive support they provide to our conclusion, that nature might not show us ultimately to be wrong. Good. This has been our first dive into the world of inductive logic. Thank you for joining me, and I look forward to having you in the next chapter of our exploration.